for funding the Monday morning series. I want to thank Copperdog for coming in, and you'll see them after the program. And I want to remind everyone, if you have a device, please silence it. If you need to, you can take a call outside of the room. And with that, I'm pleased to welcome Christopher Gorham. He is going to speak about Matisse at War, Art and Resistance in Nazi-occupied France. We're going to start with this.
By 1939, Henri Matisse was not the celebrated artist he had been earlier in the century. His wife was divorcing him, his health was failing, and in May of 1940, Hitler's blitzkrieg struck. Denmark and Norway fell, then the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and Belgium.
Das Ziel heißt Paris.
German panzer divisions crashed into France. Within a week, they were in the heart of the country, cleaving it in two.
Weit auseinandergezogen rückt die Infanterie vor.
By the third week of June, it was over. France surrendered. As millions of Parisians fled south and west from the German occupiers, hundreds of artists fled France altogether.
All artists, one way or another, had been affected by the war.
Composers, poets, and writers were deemed enemies of the state, and painters labeled as degenerate artists. But France's most famous modernist refused to leave. At age 70, Henri Matisse would stay.
It seemed to me as if I would be deserting. If everyone of value leaves, what will become of France?
In 1940, Matisse left Paris on a 100-day odyssey through occupied territory to Nice.
I want you to go to occupied France.
What do we do when we get there?
Organize resistance, act as liaison officers with London.
While enemy agents and resistance fighters played cat and mouse in the alleyways of Nice, Matisse's son, Jean, engaged in sabotage with the Allies.
Saboteurs are running extremely effective campaigns against the Germans.
His younger son, Pierre, provided a lifeline for artists who fled to New York, including Marc Chagall. Matisse wondered if his beloved daughter Marguerite was also working for the resistance.
Ship after ship from the New World brings to Britain fresh thousands of American soldiers to the springboard for invasion.
While France waited for the American and British liberators, Matisse worried over the fate of his family. He persevered in his art, inventing a new paper technique that led to some of his most iconic pieces. The Fall of Icarus, his profile of Charles de Gaulle, and his groundbreaking cutout book, Jazz. Then, just weeks before D-Day, his daughter, Marguerite, was arrested by the Gestapo.
My aunt, Marguerite Matisse, was working for the underground. She was arrested, she was tortured.
I've just had the worst shock of my life. No further details, no more news. Tear up my letter after reading it.
And Matisse faced the greatest challenge of his life. Matisse at War. Coming October 2025.
And here we welcome Christopher Gorham.
Thank you, Ona. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. I have lots of wires because of the two microphones on me, so make sure I turn this one on so everybody can hear me. Yesterday I was at the supermarket and their Apple reader wasn't working, so I had to call my wife and get the credit card number, and enter it manually into the machine. And then it timed out, so I had to call my wife back, and it was like being in a Hollywood movie where you're trying to detonate the bomb, before it goes off. So, mic is on, people can hear me. As we get to this season of thankfulness, very thankful for all of you for being here on a Monday morning. A beautiful location in North Shore, just a beautiful day out there. One that almost conjures up Matisse. He passed away in November of 1954, but we so often associate the color blue with him, and blue skies out there is a very welcome thing, so we're thankful for that. Thankful to Ona and to the Beverly Public Library for having me. Thankful also to Copper Dog Book, and please consider gifting someone as we get to the holiday season, so that poor Claudia back there doesn't have to haul a big box of books back to the store. So we want to try and relieve her of her burden. I'm happy to inscribe, happy to personalize your book or books, so please do consider that. Thank you. Marc Chagall, the artist, was born in Russia, and he said of his hometown, he said it had all the color of a potato. Now, Matisse is born in La Belle France, in beautiful France, and it's such a pretty country, but his hometown was a little dreary. It was up in the north, it was wet, it was damp, it was also, ladies and gentlemen, right in the path of the Germans if they were interested in invading France. So if you're Bismarck, if you're Hindenburg, if you're the Kaiser, and if you're Adolf Hitler, and you have designs on invading France, you're going to go right through Henri Matisse's hometown. And indeed, Matisse was born on the eve of the Franco-Prussian War. And in fact, his mother said, when he was a boy, told him stories of burying the family valuables in the garden. When Matisse was in primary school, the children sang a song, the lyrics of which went, "We are children of a frontier town, born to the smell of gunpowder." That war would not be the last war that would intrude on the life and work of Henri Matisse. He started not as a painter or an artist. He started his professional career as a lawyer. He was training to be a lawyer when a bout of appendicitis changed the course of his life. He was recuperating from appendicitis when his mother brought him a box of paints. And he said, once I held those paints in my hand, I knew that the direction of my life would change. And it would, but not very fast. He started off as a painter very slowly. In fact, when he starts painting, he's already older than the other painters that he will be friends with, because they started when they were kids or teenagers, but not him. When he started painting, his career started slowly. At one point, he was teaching painting to young students, and he gave them a piece of advice. He said, don't talk about your art. Don't try to verbalize it. Don't try to explain it with words. He said, let it speak for itself. And that was advice that he adhered to during his long career. At another moment, he was hired at an hourly wage to paint the gilding of a grand Paris exhibition hall. He was nearly 30 when he met Amélie, a woman from a proud Toulouse family. Amélie's family was progressive. They were anti-Bonapartist, anti-monarchical. And so the young painter and the woman from the progressive family sort of see eye to eye the French values of liberty and fraternity and equality. Matisse finally gained fame in 1905, and it was this painting here, Woman with a Hat, which confounded some critics because they saw these colors that almost had been squeezed directly out of the tube. You see, almost unnaturally so, for some viewers, you see tomato red and orange and wafers of green, and it's an unnatural set of colors for a portrait like that, according to some. But others saw a pioneer. Others saw that Matisse was doing something brand new. And so this painting makes him famous as the leader of the fauves, the wild beasts of French painting. And it hung in the same exhibition hall where just years before he'd been painting at an hourly wage. One critic asked Matisse, well, what color was your wife's hat? It's a riot of color. What color was it? And he said it was black, of course. The Matisses had 3 children. The first is Marguerite there on the left. Now, she was born from a previous relationship that Matisse had, but Amélie adopted her into the family and raised her as her own daughter. When Marguerite was a girl, she's the subject of so many very, very touching Matisse sketches and paintings. In fact, there was an exhibition in Paris that just ended in August where these had been collected all around the world, some from the Soviet Union, others from Japan, but they were all collected at the Museum of Modern Art there. And it was very, very moving because she's Marguerite sleeping, Marguerite reading, so many of these early sketches and paintings of his beloved daughter. When she became an adolescent and then a teenager, she was essentially the studio kid. She was washing brushes and stretching canvases and cleaning out rooms for her father to use as erstwhile studios. And as she's living at the tip of the spear of the avant-garde. I mean, at this time. When she grows into womanhood, Marguerite becomes basically the manager of the Matisse studio. She takes over for her mother. And she's now interfacing with some of the great collectors, the Stein family, the Cohn sisters of Baltimore. And Marguerite, is helping put her father's art in those grand museums, in the prestigious collections of art collectors, and really was a very critical person to Matisse's success. His son, Jean, up there with the violin, is the second born son. He wants to be a professional musician. He wants to be a professional painter. He's not quite good enough. And that was also sort of the destiny of Jean. Jean is the eldest son, wants a career in the arts, not really quite good enough, is pretty good at being at sculpture, though. So that's something that we'll keep an eye on. But Jean at first is something of a thorn in the side of his parents. Nevertheless, Marguerite said, "We were a family of artists." The second war to intrude on the life of Matisse is the Great War, the First World War. And when it broke out in 1914, he was 44 years old. And remember, he's a little bit older than the other painter friends of his. So those painters are now serving in the trenches, defending their country, and Matisse wants to do so as well. But he can't because he's too old. So he writes a government minister to appeal the decision. And the government minister writes back to him and says, "I'm sorry, you can't serve in the army, you're too old. But what you can do is you can continue to paint well." And so he does. But his paintings during the war are very, very different, folks. As you can see, the organic shapes and the riot of color is gone, being replaced by somber hues like battleship gray and moody blue. Take this painting, for instance, the Piano Lesson from 1916. It's a painting of his son, Pierre, who is the one with the violin. His son Pierre, though, was by 1916 almost old enough to be drafted into the French army. But here he's portrayed as a boy. He is behind the piano. The critics thought, well, this is a meditation at the time. This is a meditation of Matisse, the stern father. Because he'd been born in the North, because he talked to his kids with an economy of words, this is a meditation on Matisse, the stern father. He wants his son to stay behind the piano, stay on task. He's got a piano teacher making sure that he's practicing his scales, and he paints this iron scrollwork to make sure that Pierre doesn't go out in the garden, which is that triangle of green. But I would invite you to think about this painting a different way. The piano keeps Pierre in the house rather than out on the battlefield. So does the iron scrollwork. The piano teacher is a guardian. And moreover, in the foreground is a metronome. And the metronome is going tick, tick, tick. Because every day that passes, every week that passes, both Matisse sons get old enough to be drafted into the French army at a time when that war was not going well for the French. Large parts of the country were occupied, including Matisse's hometown. The Battle of Verdun was raging, and it looked very, very dire. In 1917, Jean Matisse was drafted into the French army. And in 1918, his younger son, Pierre, ran off and joined the French army just in time for the Second Battle of the Marne. And Matisse, who didn't really like to speak about his work, except to say very simply, what I try to do is convey my emotion through my line, through my color, through my design. He gives us this. bathers by a river with these wraith-like figures, almost extraterrestrial. They look a lot like the piano teacher in the previous painting. And he deliberately cuts the head off of the second figure and the feet off the fourth figure. He has a very beautiful verdant green on the left panel and a very fetching blue on the right panel. But to get from the green to the blue, you have to go through a black maw. In the middle, you have to go through a trench. So I think what Matisse is doing here is talking to us, filtering the trauma of war and the anxiety over his family and his friends and his sons. Critics at the time didn't really know what to make of this and the style of painting. Gone were the organic shapes, and in their place was the geometric shapes and the very somber set of colors. But over time, curators and experts at places like the Chicago Institute of Art started to say, well, when was he painting these paintings? They were painted during the Great War. And when we get to the World War II paintings, keep that in mind. He's filtering a lot of trauma through his work. The interwar years, the years between 1918, the end of World War I, and the beginning of World War II, 20-year period, Matisse is going to make another artistic pivot. This time, it's largely because he's in Nice. He's not in Paris anymore. He's spending more and more time in southeastern France on the Mediterranean Sea, where the palm trees are swaying and the light is otherworldly, and the colors return, as you can see. But the subject matter is different this time around. These are paintings of small hotel rooms. They're paintings of small flats. There's violin cases and flower vases. There's models and couture. And the critics were not kind to Matisse at this time. They thought he's lost his edge. He's down not in Paris anymore. He's down in the prodigious pleasures of Nice, in the sunshine and the parakeets. And he's painting these strange paintings. One critic said they're paintings of waiting and claustrophobia. Another critic said these are waitings of boredom. And a very nasty critic said, because so many of these paintings during the interwar years were French windows and French doors looking out to the sea, looking out those windows at that blue sky, one critic said very nastily, who needs another Matisse window? Well, maybe he did, because maybe he was always searching for something to convey the emotion through his line, through his color, through his design. The interwar years are also a time when that family support system that was so critical to his success in becoming a world-famous artist dissipates. Marguerite marries and starts her own life and doesn't pose for her father again. Pierre, the second son, the one with the violin, he has such a spectacularly failed marriage. He married a Corsican woman. It lasted about the length of a cup of coffee. His former father-in-law was literally chasing him around Southern Europe with a pistol. And Pierre Matisse gets on a steamer and goes to New York and really doesn't return for the rest of his life except to visit his family periodically. He becomes the American Matisse, the world-famous or internationally known gallery owner and champion of modern art, the Pierre Matisse Gallery on 57th Street in New York for decades. So he's not even in France anymore. The son behind the piano. And Jean is continuing to struggle, give his parents heartburn, his career is not happening. So the family just isn't there to support him. Matisse's wife, Amélie, by this point is depressed, she's ill. Matisse tries to bring her back to health, and she's stubbornly doesn't do that. And so the family hires an assistant for Madame Matisse. The assistant is Lydia Delektorskaya, a young Russian woman who cares for the family, but she will also take on a greater role as time goes on and will be Matisse's companion and, in fact, studio manager, just as Amélie had been, just as his daughter had been. The breakup of Matisse's family support and the bottoming out of his artistic reputation happened at the same time. And one friend of, relative rather, of Virginia Woolf, the nephew of Virginia Woolf, meets Matisse at this time and says, the man I met was not a great artist. The man I met looked like he had a good tailor. He looked like he was well fed. but he could have been an insurance man, or he could have been a man in real estate. And it just goes to show, Matisse is in some ways so out there with his art that they didn't even know what to make of it. But in many ways, a very conservative figure. So conservative in look that Quentin Bell said he's not a great artist at all because of what he wore, because of how he looked. This period of dissolution for Matisse, when he's no longer considered the great avant-garde modernist, he's considered the bourgeois whose time has passed him by, coincides with the rise of the European dictators. Mussolini in Italy in 1925, Hitler in 1933, and Franco in 1937. And the critics at the time, including people like Quentin Bell, part of what they thought Matisse had lost was the edge that living in Paris afforded him. He's now in Nice, which is not the artistic capital of France. And some critics even went so far as to say, well, he's taken the easy way out. But Matisse himself wrote multiple letters to his son in New York in which he said, we people of Nice, his adopted city, are afraid of an invasion, not from Hitler's Germany, but from their Latin neighbor, Italy, which is like 30 kilometers away. Matisse was well aware, as the people of Nice were, that Mussolini wanted Nizza back because it had once been Italian. It had been the birthplace of the Italian hero Garibaldi. And what greater prize for Il Duce than to seize the French border city of Nice and to bring it into Italian control. The rallying cry was Nizza o morte, Nice or death. But it was another European dictator that opened up the front of the cultural war. Hitler in 1937 and the Nazis, they start a so-called degenerate art exhibition where they pull art off the museum walls in Germany, that's within Germany, that was painted by Jewish artists. Those paintings are coming down. Some are being destroyed, some are being burned, some are being stored in a dark warehouse. But they're being taken off the museum walls and taken out of collections. Artists who are not Jewish, but who are modernist, Picasso, Matisse, who are painting certain paintings that, quote, insult German feeling, or, quote, insult German womanhood, are also taken off the walls and put into this degenerate art exhibit, which crisscrosses Germany. The object of this was not to engender appreciation of modern art, sometimes complicated, sometimes hard to understand, sometimes it requires patience to stand before those paintings and think about them. It wasn't to engender those appreciations of modern art. It was to mock and to jeer and to make fun of. Placards were put next to these pieces of art in which they were making fun of them and inviting people to make fun of them. They were hung crookedly. And so Matisse finds himself, by 1937, an enemy of the German state. He had tremendous fondness for a lot of German artists, German expressionists, German modern artists, but he's an enemy of German state. And if Germany takes over more and more of Europe, Matisse will be an enemy in those parts of Europe, including his own country, perhaps, of France. And this is all undergirded by this German idea of Volksgemeinschaft, this idea of racial and ethnic and cultural purity, oneness, sameness, flatness. The Cultural War became a military war in September of 1939, but the summer before that, July and August of 1939, the leading art and culture magazine in Paris, Verve, asked Matisse to prepare a cover. And this is what Matisse delivered. These are the fleur-de-lis. They're very stylized, but the fleur-de-lis, the ancient and enduring symbol of France. And because he's Matisse, it's not the white lily. It's so many colors it had to be passed through the printer 26 times. So he has these beautiful, colorful fleur-de-lis on a foreboding black background. I think Matisse is trying to tell us something through his art. This was rushed into print. Again, it had to go through 26 times. The printer published it on the last day of August 1939. At 4 in the morning the next morning, German panzer divisions crashed into Poland, igniting the Second World War. The third war that would intrude on the life of Matisse. The invasion of Poland and the start of the war set off a panic in Paris because the French people knew they were next. Hitler was coming for them. Maybe not next week, maybe not next month, but the Germans were coming for Paris, and they knew it. And so Matisse's son in New York says to his father, I have a teaching position for you in San Francisco. Matisse himself had a visa to Rio de Janeiro in his breast pocket. He had other people saying to him, look, you're 70 years old, you're not in the best of health. Get out of harm's way. But he wouldn't. He likened it to desertion. He says, if everyone of value leaves, what will become of France? The invasion came in with tremendous rapidity in May and June of 1940. The Germans invaded France. In May of that year, by the middle of June, folks, 6 weeks later, it was over. France was cut in half by the panzer divisions. The northern half of France, more than half, was occupied, Nazi-occupied. The southern portion of France was a collaborationist regime called Vichy. One of Pierre Matisse's friends said, the end for France came so suddenly it was as if a puzzle had been swept off a table onto the floor. And puzzle pieces like Pablo Picasso, they didn't even know where he was. Was Picasso in occupied Paris? Was Picasso hiding out in the unoccupied zone? Was Picasso back in Spain? Was he even in France at all? And the international press lost track of the other great modernist, Matisse. They didn't know if he was alive or dead. And in fact, he was alive, but just barely, because his stomach pains that had been bedeviling him for years got so bad by the beginning of 1941, he had to have emergency surgery. His daughter Marguerite puts her life on hold. She goes down to Nice, where Matisse was with Lydia, who's his caretaker at this point. Those two women do not get along, and they can't, there's no good doctors nearby in the neighborhood. They don't have petrol to go anywhere. So they have to get the ailing, almost dying Matisse onto a train toward the German demarcation line near Lyon. And that's where he has a surgery. One surgery becomes two. There's an infection. He's drifting between life and death for over a week. Finally, in the spring of 1941, he's able to stand. And he's able to finally walk out into the garden of the hospital. And the nurses call him the resuscitated one. Meanwhile, life under the swastika in Paris was a deeply cynical place. Not only had the Germans taken over all the administrative buildings, control of the streets, alleyways, the river, but they had taken over the bank vaults, they had taken over bank accounts of people that they deemed enemies of the state. And the man you see at the bottom left of that photograph is, I'm sure some of you will recognize, there's a Hollywood movie out about him right now. That's Hermann Goering, the second most powerful man in the Third Reich. And he, behind the degenerate art exhibit, the man behind things like Volksgemeinschaft, is ogling Matisse's. This is incredibly cynical. Not to sell, not to liquidate, to buy an old master. He actually comes to have 5 or 6 Matisses in his personal collection during World War II that were stolen from Paul Rosenberg, Matisse's dealer in Paris. Rosenberg has to flee to the United States for his life. Meanwhile, his gallery, his apartment, completely looted, including many, many Matisses. Hermann Goering, didn't matter to Hermann Goering that Matisse had a Jewish dealer and Jewish collectors in the Steins and Jewish collectors in the Cohn family. All he was interested in is getting his hands on these stolen pieces of art. As for Matisse's personal collection, the art that he owned, that he had prepared, the Cézanne that he had bought with his family, he has a personal collection of art. It's in a bank vault in Paris. It's Matisse's own family collection of his own stuff, a career's worth. He knows it is susceptible to looting. He writes his son in New York. He says, I know what efficient removal men the Germans can be. And sure enough, they show up one day at the bank. They want to see the vault. And it's not Marguerite who's in occupied Paris. It's not his daughter who tries to save his art. And it's not his estranged wife, Amélie. It's his great rival, Pablo Ruiz Picasso, the owner of the other 2 vaults. The most surprising thing I learned in my research, discovery I made in my research, is the friendship that blossomed in the spring of 1942. Matisse is very, very ill. His doctors thought if he wasn't going to die in 1941, he was likely to die in 1942. Very ill, but he's recuperating slowly in Nice. Bless you. Lydia is there with him. And one day a stranger comes to the door, and it's this man, Louis Aragon. Aragon was a surrealist poet who had been in the humiliated French army. He'd been evacuated from Dunkirk. He gets back to France, and he starts working for the communist underground. His resistance activities put him on the Gestapo hit list. He's briefly imprisoned along with his beautiful wife, Elsa Triolet. They're using an alias, and they're mistakenly freed. They use that time of freedom to go down to Nice because Aragon wants to meet the great French artist who's defiantly remaining in the country and who's defiantly continuing to work. He wants to meet this guy. So Aragon goes to Nice, and he brings his notebook because he wants to write a book about Matisse someday. And so day after day he goes to the Matisse apartment and with his notebook, and he writes down what Matisse says, which is probably not very much, but he makes his observations of Matisse, how he works, how he lives. And Matisse can't really stand at this point in his life, so he's sitting down, sometimes in a wheelchair, and he has a sketchbook. And he sketches Aragon day after day after day. And finally, Aragon gets fed up with it. He said, I was down there to meet Matisse and take the measure of him. And of course, he's taking my measure. And it was somewhat frustrating for Aragon. He said he would look at me with that blue hunter's gaze, which was a very Matisse-ian thing to do. He just kind of fix his eyes on you as if he was trying to paint you or draw you. But their friendship lasted, their friendship born in war. And Aragon becomes known as the poet of the French resistance, along with Paul Eluard. Their friendship born in war lasts for their respective lifetimes. And Aragon in 1972 finally got around to publishing his book on Matisse, 2 volumes, 850 pages. And he recalled in that book those dangerous days in 1942, and he wrote, the time had come to be aware of the national reality of Matisse because he was of France, because he was France. You didn't have to be a sloganeer if you were Matisse. You didn't have to throw hand grenades at the enemy if you were Matisse. You had to just remain in your country and do the thing that you did. And people knew, the French people knew when he put a little tricolor in one of his paintings in 1942, what he was up to. When he conjured some of the French heroes of the Middle Ages who'd been captured by the enemy, the French people knew exactly what he was trying to communicate to them. Of course, the censors, it went over their heads. In 1943, Matisse begins work on not only the greatest work of his wartime output, but one of the greatest pieces of work of his long career. And it's not paintings, and it's not sculpture. It's colored paper. Thick sheets of Canson paper, colored to the exacting hues of Matisse. And then he would take the shears, multiple sets of scissors and shears, and he would wield them with the same acuity as the paintbrush and the pencil. How? Because his potato-colored hometown was also a textile hub. So Matisse, the boy, grew up with this. And so he can use the scissors with tremendous precision. And he cuts out these sometimes organic shapes and sometimes very jagged shapes. And he asked Lydia to put them up on the wall in certain configurations. And if you see these up close, which I have done, hundreds of pinholes. You can see the pinholes in these. But when the prototype was done, when the composition was to his liking, Matisse said, freeze it there, because this is going to go into a book that I want to prepare. And the book was not meant for collectors, not meant for wealthy collectors, Russians, Americans, or other. This was a book where you could take the plates out individually, fold them up, loan it to your friend, tape one up to your kitchen wall. In other words, this book was democratic. And the title, too, was democratic. The working title was Le Cirque, the circus. The absolute opposite of Volksgemeinschaft, cultural, ethnic, racial purity. What better thing to do if you're Matisse and you're subtle than to spotlight the most marginalized people, the people who make their living under the circus tent, the sword swallower, the human cannonball, the Roma. Matisse was personal friends with Roma jazz guitarist Django Reinhardt. And when he finally titled this work, it was Jazz, for the same reason as the circus, because jazz was anathema to the enemy. The Nazis, the Vichy's, they didn't like jazz. Jazz was a quote-unquote mongrel American art form. Improvisational instead of planned. It celebrated other cultures instead of just one. And so he names it jazz, I think, deliberately, just as he had previously named it the circus. That's Lydia there on the right. And the photograph is taken by Henri Cartier-Bresson, one of the great photographers of this era, who escaped from a German work camp, made his way down to Nice because he too wanted to meet Matisse. And he too had a similar experience. He was trying to talk to Matisse, and Matisse was in the garden with a pigeon in one hand, and literally a Milanese pigeon in his one hand, and he was sketching it with his other hand, saying nothing, not even looking over at Bresson. But I think it's just notable that not only did the poet of the French Resistance, Aragon, specifically go down there to meet him, but Bresson, of course, went down there to meet him as well. And not only that, Picasso's companion of these years, a young woman named Françoise Gillot, who was in her mid-20s at this time, during World War II, and herself a painter. She said, with Eluard and Aragon, the poets of the Resistance, we also had Matisse. He was, her words, a beacon to us young people in those dark days of the occupation. Some of these plates, there are 20 plates in total in the jazz series. Some of them are very pleasing. They have the organic shapes. They have the vibrant color that we associate with Matisse. But others, ladies and gentlemen, have a latent violence to them. Take, for instance, the sword swallower. Is that a circus performer or a torture victim? Matisse, one of his practices was always to take a piece of art, if he could, and turn it over and upside down and sideways to look at the, quote, strength of the line. And he did this with his own work. And he's also sitting up in bed working at this time, or sitting in a chair at this time, because he can't stand at the easel. That's why he did the paper cutouts in the first place. And Lydia would, if he's sitting up in bed, Lydia would bring over one of the prototypes, and she might set it down the wrong way, or upside down, or sideways. And folks, you see what's happening here. The sword swallower gets flipped over, and Matisse says, aha, that looks like somebody I know. That looks a lot like the leader of the Free French forces in London, General Charles de Gaulle, the defiant tilt of the chin, the Gallic nose, the kepi on his head. This was called, at the time, Matisse called this Monsieur Loyal. And commentators, even in 1944, said, that looks a lot like de Gaulle from the profile. And Matisse, to put a fine point on it, has these round yellow and gold circles on either side of the profile to match the buttons on the general's uniform. And again, Matisse is telling us something. I think what he's saying here, Monsieur Loyal, by the way, means ringmaster in French. That's the phrase that is the same as ringmaster. What Matisse, I think, is telling us with this is there's going to be a new ringmaster coming to town. The circus is on the way out, and the Republic is back. 1944 was a year of waiting and worry for Matisse. His daughter Marguerite had previously, during the war, sent her son, her only son, to live in New York with her brother and her estranged husband. And Matisse was actually there just by coincidence in Marseille when they sent Claude to the United States. And Marguerite said to her father, I will make myself useful up in occupied Paris. And previous to that, she said, I would rather die with pistols in my hand than live under the German yoke. So if Matisse worried about not only his son Jean, who was hanging out by the beach in Antibes, maybe helping British intelligence, but he's worried about Jean, he was also worried about Marguerite, who was almost 50 years old at this point, but very, very headstrong, and unburdened by her son, and free to take action on what she wanted to do for her country. If Matisse worried that his daughter may be entertaining ideas of joining the French resistance, he was correct. She did. Marguerite Matisse, age 50, joined a cell of the French resistance. Her job, she was given a code name. There's a dossier in French on her wartime service kept by the Free French Forces of the Interior. She was given a code name, and her job was to ferry information from Paris by train to Brittany in advance of the Allied invasion, in advance of D-Day. She had been a consistent correspondent with her father throughout her life, and she finally goes silent. And Matisse is beset with worry. Has anyone heard anything? And the answer was no. As de Gaulle prepared in London to come over with the invasion forces, and as the Allies prepared for their invasion of Normandy, they were preparing for a second invasion, a second D-Day on the southern coast of France, the invasion of Provence. It was going to be called Operation Dragoon. And it turned out not to be as deadly as D-Day, but they didn't know that at the time. And moreover, I think it's just notable that the critics of Matisse, both in the 1940s up until even sort of recently, people who say in the newspaper Matisse is a painter of pretty flowers or pretty things, there's a degree of truth to that. But he was well aware of the danger of living in Nice, going all the way back to the time of Mussolini's invasion, because Mussolini did invade Nice and did control that area from 1940 to 1942. And it gets worse, because then the Germans take over for them, and the Germans are in control of that city and that region. So Nice becomes part of the war. It becomes a theater of war. You have Italian fascists, you have Nazi Germans, you have the Allies in North Africa, then Sicily, then Italy, 30 kilometers away, and they need to bomb a bunch of Nice because Nice feeds into Italy through rail, through road, through water. And one night, 500 Niçois were killed by bombers. Not by the Germans, not by the Italians, by us, American bombers. It was so bad that school children and the elderly had to be evacuated from the city. So Matisse and Lydia decide they're going to move out up to the hills about 10 miles away, where they hope the Germans will leave them unmolested. This was a wishful thinking that turned out not to be completely true. And I also note on this slide that Matisse, one of the slides from the jazz series is the cowboy. And I just find it sort of fascinating because he not only had been to the United States, Matisse had, but his son was essentially half American and was giving him information about the art scene, or lack of art scene, in New York at the time. So Matisse knows more about the United States than a lot of his French contemporaries or continental contemporaries. And it might also be the case that Matisse, who loved American jazz and who was fond of many American aspects, it might also be the case that he was also very, very appreciative of the fact that they had saved Paris in 1918 and were preparing to liberate France a second time. As we get close to the end of the talk, and I would invite you to think about questions for the Q&A upcoming. But in May of 1944, Matisse got the terrible news. His daughter and wife, estranged wife, were arrested in separate arrests. He was able to find out the location of his wife, Amélie, who was in her mid-70s. She had been using an Hermes typewriter to type up instructions on how to use a Sten submachine gun for the communist underground, which was, according to her, the most well-organized resistance network. At age 75, she was arrested, and she was given, her sentence was doubled, and Matisse was able to find this out and also able to find out that she was being held in a prison outside of Paris, a not very nice one, by the way. As for his daughter, he tried mightily to find out where she was, if she were even still alive. In fact, at one point, he had to hold his nose and reach out to someone who turned collaborationist to try and find out from the Nazis themselves or the Gestapo what exactly had happened, and he was unable to get any information from that source either. He was overcome with anxiety and worry, as you can see from this letter he writes to his old mate, Charles Camoin. I've just had the worst shock of my life. My wife and daughter have been arrested. No further details, no more news. Tear up my letter after reading it. And once again, ladies and gentlemen, I think Matisse is talking to us through his art. Pierre said, his son, who knew more modern artists than his own father, because he was a gallery owner. He knew all these guys, Chagall and Max Ernst, and of course Matisse and Picasso, and just dozens and dozens and dozens. Pierre Matisse told the New York Times in 1942, he said, artists, they don't paint skulls. They're not going to paint, cannonballs. What they do is they filter the trauma of war through their art. And it's up to us to stand before it and to observe it and to think about it and to put it in that context. And so we have this, The Wolf from 1944, one of the jazz plates. This is got the Matisse colors that we associate with him, the fuchsia, the orange stripe, the organic shapes on the left. But that central image is one of latent violence. Lydia Delectorskaya called it the beast with the blood-stained eye. And when they asked Lydia about and then the late curator in New York, Reva Castleman, said, "Oh, the wolf, that was a stand-in for the Gestapo." Because the beast had Matisse's daughter. When we think of Matisse, the evergreen nature of his art, the joy that it brings us when we stand before them in Baltimore or in Chicago or in Paris or in Nice, the colors, the vibrancy, unlike any other artist I can think of, a sense of just transcendent joy. But yet, a life that was bookended by war, a hometown that was conquered 3 times and occupied 3 times. And as we get close to the end of the war, a war that will be the 3rd in Matisse's lifetime, the beast has his beloved daughter in its jaw. Folks, thank you for being here with me today. And I hope you've brought some questions so we can have some Q&A. Yes? Oh, is it okay to start with the questions?
Yes, please.
Okay.
So since the Nazis didn't like Matisse, why didn't they go to Nice to arrest him?
It's a great question. Why didn't the Nazis just simply go and arrest Henri Matisse? The answer, I think, is he's a world-famous artist. He's supposed to die in 1941. He's gravely ill. He's not really mobile. He's just kind of stuck down there. And he's not outwardly, sloganeering against the regime. In fact, he was criticized for this, but he went on Vichy radio at one point, and talked about art. He was asked questions about art, and he talked about art. So, the critics said, well, that just goes to show you he's really a collaborationist. And I think Picasso the same way. Picasso was not only an enemy of the German state, but of the Spanish fascist. And a younger man, and a healthier man. So why didn't they just go and arrest Picasso? But what they would do in Picasso's case is show up at his atelier in Paris and say, "You're Jewish, aren't you, Picasso?" And they would barge in, and they would, they'd kick over artworks, and they'd steal linens, and they'd make his life kind of just let him know that they were watching him. And in Matisse's case, the sort of molestation was, "We know that your companion is Russian." Obviously, Germans hated the Russians at this point. So they she didn't have papers, and they were kind of, that was the, and of course they didn't know that until it was too late, really, that both his son and his daughter were involved in resistance activities. Great question. I think they were just too famous, and in Matisse's case, too ill and too old to bother with that. But a good question.
Bad PR.
Bad PR? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it would have looked terrible. You're hounding this man who might live another 6 months. He lived until 1954, by the way. So he had a second life. But yeah, it would have been terrible PR. Absolutely right. Yes?
What happened to his daughter and his wife?
You got to buy one of these from Claudia in the back. I will say the exhibit in Paris that ran from the spring into the summer is about Marguerite, and in large, well, it's about Marguerite, but the wartime story of Marguerite is also embedded in that exhibition. And it was very just wonderful to see that that's the story that's in that book is the story that they're telling each other in Paris. I mean, that's what happened. There's literally a file on her that's a government file, so that I don't know if she was eligible for a pension, but that's sort of what it looks like to me. It looks like pension paperwork with her code name, what she did, where she was stationed. And it was just so eye-opening for me because, you can't just take someone's word that they're in the resistance. You have to, they have to apply, and you have to know where they are and all of that for safety's sake. But I hope that my book is the English language version of her story. And in fact, one review said that Marguerite Matisse is the unsung hero of the book. So I'm pleased about that. Other questions? I saw a couple of hands. Yes?
I'm sorry, I was a little late, so maybe you said this, but what led you to want to explore this topic?
What led me to this topic is really a couple of things. One was from the time I was a boy, history. But when I read about the poets of World War I, it sort of was like art and history. You know, these doomed poets, they know they're going to die. They're still creating their poetry. They're still writing as the bullets and the shells are flying over their heads. And most of them do die and leave this very moving legacy behind of their World War I poetry. So I thought art and war would be wonderful. What story could I possibly tell? My wife and I, the second part is my wife and I have been very fortunate we were married in Nice back in 2002. We've been there 20 times. You can't go anywhere in that city without the shadow of Matisse. Where he lived, where he painted, where his museum is, where his friends lived. So I don't think there's any book if I didn't have that relationship with the beautiful city of Nice. If you haven't been, put it on your list. It is, yes.
I want to live there.
You and me both.
Yeah.
You and me both want to live there. 300 days of sunshine a year, just magnificent beauty. And the light, which is why he went. The light is just otherworldly. And the third reason is the critics. There was a critic I came across who'd written a book in the early 90s who really took him to task, who said Matisse was really latently collaborationist because he went on Vichy radio, because he didn't outwardly do active resistance and so forth. And I thought, how is it possible that he could be pro-Vichy, pro-Pétain, when his daughter was literally risking her life to be in the resistance? So I thought this is maybe an opportunity to write that book about art and war and try and figure out the answer to that question. Yes, in the back.
Do you know if there's paintings of his locally, like the Museum of Fine Arts or anything?
Yes, they're at Museum of Fine Art. Fogg Museum has some sketches, some really beautiful sketches of Marguerite from the father, from Matisse. Not far from here, not too far from here at least, Baltimore has one of the grandest Matisse collections in the world because of the Coen sisters. I have a little story about them too. But the Baltimore Museum, incredible. Chicago Art Institute has Bathers by a River. So up and down the sort of megalopolis, eastern seaboard, lots of places to see Matisse's. But back to the Coen sisters of Baltimore, they were tremendous collectors of Matisse. The Steins were sort of went more Picasso after a time, but the Coen sisters were all Matisse all the time. And a visitor to their apartment in Baltimore, or someone paid a visit to their apartment in Baltimore and said, "You looked at the wall and you saw the future." Yeah. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, the Dragoon slide that you had, there were a couple of colored plates in the upper right-hand corner. Could you go back
Yes.
and go over those a little?
Yep. The cowboy.
Yeah.
Yeah. The lasso. Yeah. And, I maybe he saw this, maybe they had cowboys in the circus in the continent of Europe, I don't know. But maybe it's a little bit of a love letter to the country that is sending troops to defend his country and liberate France. But just speculation on my part, but I find it interesting. Yeah. Other questions? How are we doing on time, Ona?
Let's do two more.
Couple more. Do we have two more? I'm a former high school history teacher.
Yeah. Did Matisse ever come to the United States?
Yes.
Okay.
A couple of times.
To see his son?
Yes. Yeah. He saw, in fact, when he installed, he did these big giant murals for a man named Barnes, who was an industrialist outside of Philadelphia. And he did these massive murals for Barnes. And I laughed because Matisse spent like 2 years working on these back in France, only to find out that the specifications were wrong. So they were frenemies. Barnes and Matisse did not really get along all that well, although he was helpful in terms of paying him money. So he had to go back to the drawing board, literally, do these murals again. And when he went to install them, he obviously saw his son, who was in New York at the time. And they were consistent correspondence across the Atlantic during the war until the postal censors started stopping some of the letters. So he, too, went silent for a while during the war. I should also say, while we're on the subject of Pierre Matisse, I'll take Marc Chagall. Marc Chagall is white. Marc Chagall is Jewish. He has to leave France or he might not live, right? He might be sent to one of the extermination camps. He, with the help of an American named Varian Fry, whose name might be familiar to some of you, Chagall gets out of Nazi-occupied Europe and he gets to New York. And then he says, I'm Russian, I'm French, I don't want to be in New York. I don't know the language, I don't have any career here. And he goes to a name that looks very familiar. He goes to Pierre Matisse. And he says, what can I do? And Pierre Matisse becomes the great champion of Marc Chagall in the United States. We don't have Marc Chagall on our dorm room wall, but for Pierre Matisse. He exhibited him 13 times, was a tremendous, tremendous champion of Marc Chagall and gave him a career here in the United States. So all three of the Matisse children did their bit during these dark times of the war. Folks, thank you so much for being here this morning with me.